Slowed down. So yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Matt Jones from Data One at UC Santa Barbara, and we're here today to talk about activities associated with the schema.org cluster, the Science on Schema.org cluster at ESIP. The title of this session is Extending Science on Schema.org for International Compatibility. And one of our goals is just to try to understand and think about what our next set of activities is for the cluster. So Science on Schema.org is an effort that Adam and Doug Phil started, and I think has grown into a really healthy ESIP cluster focused on designing and developing common publishing patterns for describing research data so that that can be presented on web pages and picked up by search engines like Google, Data One, and Geocodes, and others that are focused on searching for and finding data sets. So the Science on Schema.org guidelines are a set of conventions to try to make it clearer how people can effectively mark up their data sets on their websites and make those available to the general search and science communities, as well as to represent information about data repositories. So basically information about the facilities that hold that data set. In 2022, we were really happy to be able to successfully publish version 1.3 of the Science on Schema.org guidelines. I have a citation at the bottom of this slide, which basically is a citation to the Science on Schema.org guidelines. And these were really, much to our pleasure, endorsed by the ESIP Federation members. And I think there's generally widespread agreement that adopting these guidelines will make it easier for people to do data discovery and open data across the Federation. So the data set properties, we've shown this slide a lot. There are a wide variety of common properties, as well as some more advanced publishing techniques. They cover things like how to represent identifiers, variables in data sets, how to point to other metadata distributions, how to represent space and time, people, publishers and providers, funding information, and licensing information, among other things. There's a set of nice diagrams that help explain the relationships, and some tutorials on how to structure the information in a web page using JSON-LD, which is the syntax that we recommend for people to provide this information in their web pages. So we're not going to go over that a lot, except to say that the current published guidelines go into a fair amount of detail about each of these areas. And in this particular session, what we're looking at is what do we want to do next and where do we want to go in the future. So a couple of days ago, I was happy to see that Google published a new announcement, basically for increasing their support for schema.org markup of data sets. So Google runs a Google dataset search service that's been experimental. And just a couple of days ago, they announced that that has now been incorporated into the main Google search results. So if you search for something like California snowpack datasets, now there will be a datasets section within the results that lists datasets that are relevant to that particular result, which is really cool. It's like front and center in Google. And then secondly, they've extended their support for structured information for tabular data in particular. And so now, in addition to listing the data tables and stuff that are present within a data set, Google has the ability to describe the structure of those data sets using the CSV for the web standard that's out there. And so they're starting to diversify the set of standards that they support. So CSV for the web, as well as the DCAT standard. And so there are some opportunities for us to think about how these new additions to Google Dataset Search might impact our thinking about the Science on Schema.org guidelines. So this session is really intended for us to understand where we might want to do new work within the cluster. I think everybody's pretty happy with the endorsement that we got from ESIP and the current status of the guidelines. And we'd really like to push for different groups and repositories to implement this and adopt it across the landscape. So that adoption theme is probably an ongoing one throughout the cluster. But then the question is there new work that we want to undertake? Like, are there new terms for data repositories or for data set? So for example, we've talked about things like building out better conventions around indicating which repository is authoritative for a data set, clarifying the publisher versus the provider role, representing the Z dimension in coverage information about data sets, like either depth or elevation, and a bunch of other things. But we've also talked about whether or not we should extend science on schema.org to other areas, new types of classes. So one proposal might be to focus on observing assets that are in the field, instruments, deployments, platforms, and other sorts of things. There have been people working on software through groups like CodeMeta and the new scicodes.net network, and possibly other areas. And so today's goal is to basically think about what kind of new work we might want to do and who might want to do that. So we have 3 lightning talks today, one from Melinda Minch talking about the Polder effort to implement science on schema.org for Arctic repositories, one from Pierre-Luigi Buttigieg on Ocean Info Hub, and one on the Polar Observing Assets Working Group by Bill Manley. Plan is for each of those to be 5 minutes. We'll have about 30 minutes total for that in this talk, and then we'll go on to a second part of the thing, which is a discussion. That discussion will take the 60 minutes of the end of the session, broken into 2 parts. The first of which I think that we'll focus on extensions, like what are the areas of shared interest in extensions, and the second one, how can we build a roadmap for what we're planning on doing in the cluster for the next year or 2. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing, and Linda, if you wanted to pick up your slides and share them, we could start with Melinda. And while Melinda's going, if anybody had any comments or questions, Adam, if you'd like to say a few words about the cluster, that would be great while Melinda's getting set up.
Thank you, Matt, for that introduction. Just want to say the cluster meets Thursdays, 2:30, I think the 3rd Thursday of the month, but the details are on the GitHub page. We love having new people jump in, bring new ideas and fresh thought to the group. So everyone's welcome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Matt and Adam. Hello, everyone. A lot of you know me. A lot of you have heard about Polder before. So Matt, if you have a gong you want to ring at 5 minutes, that would be just fine, or something like that. A big cane to drag me off the stage. So I'm, along with Chantel Very and a co-op student, Yumisi Ogumbemi, are working on building a federated search website for specifically the polar data community. And we're working in the World Data System International Technology Office, which is nominally based in Victoria, British Columbia. So what Polder stands for is Polar Data Discovery Enhancement Research. Polder is also a word in Dutch that means to work together to achieve a common goal. It's a collaboration between a few different research bodies, Antarctic and Arctic research bodies, which is more rare than we would all like. And we've been working on 2 things, which is to develop a set of best practices for marking up data sets for the polar community using schema.org, and building a federated search website to crawl and search those data sets. So at the moment, the website, which is search.polder.info, it's built using a web app built in Flask, Python Flask. It uses Gleaner, which many of you are familiar with, to crawl sites that are marked up with schema.org and get their data sets. It also queries Data1's index, so it federates in that way. And right now we're also working on exposing the index that it builds with Gleaner to be queryable by other sites as well, so we can have a more federated federation. So part of this work involves getting people to mark up their data sets with schema.org metadata, specifically the polar community. And it's, you know, like I built a thing like, how is it going? So it turns out there's a lot of different ways to adhere to a standard. The one that we have promulgated with this group, the ESIP-SOSO standard. And some of the things that I personally have been doing to help out with that have been things like when I crawl people's data sets, there are a few different ways to specify things like context. We've ended up normalizing those. There's some Sparkle querying complexity built in because there are a lot of different ways still of specifying different kinds of data set metadata. Are you using a string? Are you using an object with a value? Are you using an array of objects? Are your keywords GCMD keywords with little arrows? How do you want to make this all fit into a nice UI? Geoshapes are pretty fun. I recently worked on spatial coverage, and the way that Geoshape does bounding box isn't quite like the way PyGeoJSON wants a bounding box to be. So we ended up doing some work to get geoshapes out of schema.org and onto the front end of a website in a sensible way. Did you know that you can use geoshape circle? You can just specify a point and a radius? Pretty wild, huh? I didn't know that until a couple months ago. So in addition to the work that Chantel and I have been doing to get people to adhere to ESIP SOSO with their data set metadata, there's all this other work that once they adhere to these standards, it's still kind of hard for a computer to deal with. And so we've got those two different sides of the equation. So one of the things that we're doing to help people with this is giving workshops. One of the workshops is in just over 2 hours, actually. And another one is on February 7th if your agenda is full for this afternoon. And you can learn more and register at this link in the slides. And finally, since this meeting is about where we might take ESIP SOSO in the future, I have some ideas. One thing that I think would be really great for the Polar community is to implement and support traditional knowledge labels. And if you don't know what those are labels for data sets or any sort of data that are about the data. It's about preserving indigenous data. So if you have data that was created or is about indigenous people, you can mark up that data with traditional knowledge labels in order to say things like, this is a closed practice and you have to have permission to see this data, or this is data about people and you need permission to share it, or this is totally open and it's fine for everyone to know about this.
So 1 minute, Melinda.
Okay, thank you. One thing that I had problems with in building this website was that there are places in the tool chain that I was using where UTF-8 wasn't the default. And so I would get weird Unicode bugs. I can talk about that more later. And finally, there's been this really interesting discussion on the bioschemas mailing list recently about ways of linking to metadata that aren't exactly what we've been doing. So it might be interesting to engage with that. Things like linking to your JSON ILD markup in an HTTP header or in the head of a page. And that's my talk. You can read more about this stuff at these links. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Melinda. That was really great. And the local context stuff is really nice. So we should add that into our list of things to look at. So next up, we have Pierre Buttigieg to talk about the Ocean Info Hub. So Pierre, if you want to put up your screen, maybe Melinda, you could stop sharing yours, and there's Pierre's.
Okay, can you hear me?
All right, yep, great.
Great, so I'm going to keep this really short. I put some links in the chat, so for some other supplementary presentations that we've been giving. But this is just a brief intro to the Ocean Info Hub project and the Ocean Data and Information System. This is a project implemented by IODE of UNESCO and supported by the Government of Flanders, Kingdom of Belgium. I'm leading the technical work package, and then with Doug and Jeff McKenna, we're connecting a whole bunch of ocean partners in a very similar way to what Polder is doing in the Polar community. In fact, one of our objectives is to cross-query between the ocean graph that's based on JSON-LD, the same thing, schema.org JSON-LD, and the Polar graph, and hopefully many other graphs, so that we can have cross-graph interoperability and build a digital ecosystem like that. Right, so project's running for 4 years. The main idea is to improve discovery and access to projects, let people know who has what, because as powerful as some of these regional infrastructures are becoming, we still can't cross query between them very effectively. So we're just trying to nudge them to share their digital asset catalogs in more web standard ways. And again, it's all very familiar to this crowd, I'm sure, the use of web architectural patterns, using things that are well used out there in the global community, so people around the world in different capacity regions can hire a developer off the street and they'll know what to do. And that's pretty important. And once we connect those things, they become part of this ocean data and information system, which is just the sum of all the partners. So we have some time left, and we're just plugging in more partners and creating, as Matt, as you sort of mentioned, we're creating more types or patterns of different kinds of asset sharing, from vessels to vessels, sensors, platforms, data sets, of course, documents, and others. When those are being implemented, if they're not already out there. It works on three things. The first thing is a catalog of sources that the IODE has been running for a number of years now. We're kind of amping that up to point us to the site maps where we can find their metadata catalogs. Once they're listed there, they become part of the ODIS, the Ocean Data and Information System, and then Ocean Info Hub pulls in those catalogs and demonstrates how you can create a front-end portal. It's a demonstrator because any partner can do it. And that's the one thing that's helping our democratization of the whole thing, right? So we're just saying that Ocean Info Hub shows people that they can show their funders, hey, look, it's working. We can cross-query now. Let's build our own local or thematic portals. And that's also working. We have them set up. It works very much like has been mentioned. People just embed some JSON-LD using schema.org on their website. Gleaner or any other indexer can pull it into a graph database through an object store, and you can then start building stuff on top of it. That's basically it. We keep it simple and lightweight, again, so it can be implemented. Right now, that first level of metadata interoperability is the stepping stone to deeper interoperability as you dig into data types and services, etc. So the whole point is, again, that when somebody queries any kind of data source, it doesn't have to be the one to rule them all. It should be able to query everybody else around the world and say, hey, who has data that can satisfy this query? And as we sort of mature towards a data space, they can pull back what they need and deliver it back to the user. Again, we see ODIS and OIH as the first stepping stone in that, and it's part of a decadal strategy as part of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. The thing that I like to say, I mean, this one-stop shop thing always it irks me. Because nobody can build it, but we can build global supply chains to create a supermarket-like experience, but we have to also focus on the back end of that. So our three implementation regions are Latin America, Africa, and the PSIDs, the Pacific Small Island Developing States. Those were very deliberately chosen by IODE to make sure it's inclusive of those regions, and each one has developed their own thematic portal based on the same technology. And so we're pulling in from their regional hubs and also smaller scale initiatives, and that's been going quite well. In fact, it's been expanding. Our initial thing was to connect 2 partners. We have now more than 50, and more and more are being plugged in, including those from Europe, from Canada. CUSE is in there. EMODNet that's a major European data hub, and a few from the US are being plugged in. More are coming because, again, it's easy. And also they get that added value of, as has been mentioned, connecting with other major search repositories. So similar principles to what we've discovered. It's sustainable because if we disappear tomorrow, the nodes inside ODIS can still talk to each other. It doesn't depend on any central architecture, but what we're doing at the UN level is using that convening and, let's say, convention building power of UNESCO and IOC to get the regions to agree on how to share these patterns and say, okay, we'll do it this way. That little nudge, that sort of soft power thing, is actually helping a lot in terms of alignment because it's mostly a social problem, not a technical one. So those are the core profiles we're working with: experts and institutions, documents, spatial maps, projects, training, and vessels. Also data sets are included in there. And those are the kind of sort of patterns and templates we provide in JSON-LD schema.org, inspired very much by SOSA. And we're just trying to nudge people towards more conventional usage of those types. We publish that in documentation, which our partners look at, and also suggest revisions to and extensions of. Yeah, that's what it looks like. Nothing too spectacular for this crowd. And then that's what we build our knowledge graph from. So as our partners, like these are in Africa, our African region said, hey, look, we need more metadata for our platforms, instruments, and sensors. We said, sure, we'll give it a crack. And we start to cook up a new specification for that. All of that's on our GitHub repo. It's all available online. Others have said, hey, look, we need something for hazards and disasters to report in. Again, that crosses over to other ESIP clusters here too. And others, again, for protected areas. They tell us what their main metadata concerns are, and then we try to spin it together into a template definition for JSON-LD sharing using schema.org.
Okay,
As
Pierre.
vanilla, as
but one more minute.
All right. As vanilla as possible. We try to keep it as vanilla as possible, but of course, sometimes you have to add in a little bit more semantics. We can embed that sometimes when you have something very specific, like the essential ocean variables that the global ocean observing system wants. We can embed that, again, just using that same sort of variable measured and putting in property values where we can link out to other ontologies. This was slides presented at the semantics harmonization cluster stuff too. And so this is a link point between that lightweight schema.org graph and a more formal ontological graph that can come from an ontology or a vocabulary, GCMD over there, or whatever you want. So again, we're trying to help graphs merge into one another and figure out how people want to share data so we can co-design the system together. The portal then that can be supported, just harvesting those JSON-LD and those patterns that were described and creating sort of a nice sort of simple search experience with automatically generated facets, again, coming from what people are filling in their metadata. We don't know what it is until we get it. And if they fill out their spatial data quite well, it also supports nice spatial searches. This one from OBIS, the Ocean Biodiversity Information System. So that's it. We're just trying to stabilize how this metadata is being exchanged. The Otis architecture and the convening power helps make these things, let's say, understood for a wide base of users. And we see it as a sort of stepping stone to deeper and deeper interoperability. Back at Helmholtz, we basically have some resources for you. The slides will be shared, don't worry. And back at Helmholtz, we basically cloned that system to create something for the Helmholtz Federation, our institutes in Germany. We just sort of cloned it, and now we'll be reshaping some of those patterns to fit our user base. So we've kind of confirmed that indeed it's all portable and our developers can get on it really quickly, which we find very promising. All right, that's it.
All right, thank you, Pierre. Appreciate that. So I really like the list of new resource types that you listed there, and I think it would be great if we could bring that back in the discussion when we come back to that. So with that, let's turn it over to Bill Manley, who's going to talk about the Polar Observing Assets Working Group and some of the work they've been focusing on with new metadata areas for observing networks.
Great, thanks for having me. Today, I'd like to talk about metadata interoperability for sites, projects, mobile platforms, and other types of observing assets. I say that because we're a long ways away from metadata interoperability for, within the realm of environmental observing and monitoring. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Polar Observing Assets Working Group, or POWIG, which is a collaborative effort under an international organization, SAON. And the whole point of this is a bridge between the polar data communities and the polar observing communities to make observing related information, structured information, more fair. We have three tasks: creating a registry of polar observing networks, polar observing systems, I use them interoperably, focusing on metadata, on interoperability parameters, and then building crosswalks across the few existing relevant metadata standards for observing assets, and then creating recommendations for adoptions and implementation, in particular for observing networks to more easily populate, deploy, and share catalogs of observing assets. So by observing assets, we mean components of in situ observing for infrastructure, such as sites, meaning stations, facilities, moorings, etc., or mobile platforms, or projects, or campaigns, also activities such as projects, campaigns, meaning scientific cruises or periods of fieldwork, and then initiatives, which is coordinated organizations, networks, etc. So, for example, there are many observing networks and related organizations that have polar portals that built and shared catalogs of observing assets that they track. Now, not all of these really are metadata catalogs. Some of these are just tables on web pages or in PDFs of different sites, projects, etc. And so we're a long ways away from the level of interoperability for data or data repositories. So the real challenge is the lack of interoperability, there's a lot of reinventing the wheel, a lot of apples and oranges that get in the way of us having a more comprehensive perspective on observing to help plan or integrate. Reinventing the wheel. Most of these portals do not share information through machine readable access, and there's a lot of duplicated time and effort. So getting back to the definition we have for observing assets, what we did to get us there was to look at asset types, concepts, patterns, whatever, as reported by 43 portals that track such things. And so upper left, for example, there's a lot of things that could be considered sites or stations, observing sites, field sites, study sites, research sites. Oh, and then the font here is proportional to the number of portals that use the same term, right? So compare that over to the right, where any portal that tracks projects, anything like projects, well, they use the term projects. There aren't that many that we found anyway, and this is an incomplete list that track what we might call mobile platforms. But then there's a lot of interest in particular for logistical or administrative purposes in the bottom center to track scientific cruises or field campaigns, that kind of thing, as well as to the right, observing systems and networks, programs, etc. So what POWIG did then was cluster these things and then categorize them. And so these are the asset types that we see: sites, projects, mobile platforms, campaigns, and initiatives. And I believe that each concept within a bubble could probably use the same schema, but that you'd have to have different schemas for different bubbles, if you follow me. So we're aware of these different metadata standards for observing assets, for asset types. And for example, for sites, there's quite a bit out there, but still it's early days and prime opportunity to streamline things for networks and other organizations that track observing assets. In gray and smaller font are these, they're not really standards, but they're well-documented implementations or guides. And then for projects, so Otis is taking on and doing a good job on the schema side of things for projects, as well as for vessels. More could be done for, say, buoys. And then for what we could call campaigns, there's a lot of interest there and not much conformity or convergence. And initiatives, say for observing networks, POWIG is developing a network level metadata model for our registry of observing networks that we could share, or hopefully somebody could run away with. But I think maybe a prime target here would be environmental and research sites.
One more minute, Bill. Oh,
so yeah, how about that? So if you want to hear more or learn more about POWIG, see our short statement from the Arctic Observing Summit that is at our website. Feel free to sign up for information or to join the collaborative effort. Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you, Bill. That was really, really great. Really nice how you broke everything down into those 5 areas. So I took notes on that in our notes, and I'd like to come back to that one as well. So maybe before we break into discussion, we can open the floor to see if anybody has questions for Melinda, Pierre, or Bill about the stuff that they presented and how that might impact the science on schema.org clusters sort of future activities. Karen and Valerie in particular, I guess there's a couple things that you guys have put in the chat. You guys want to raise those, or?
Sure. I was just sort of struck by the similarities between some of the terminology discussed in the Airborne Data Management Working Group. Very similar to the POAG asset types. And I wonder how much might be a title misunderstanding that the Airborne Data Management working group isn't just airborne stuff. It's supposed to be inclusive of like all of their suborbital platforms, including, you know, buoys and in situ measurements. And it seems like there's a bit of potential overlap there that it might be worth tagging up to close the loops.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry,
So,
I
Bill,
missed
you
part
wanna-
of that. What was the other organization? OBO? No.
No, it's the Airborne Data Management Group. If you look at the chat, there's a little bit of a
Awesome,
summary
great.
of what she said there as well.
Yes. So there was a talk yesterday. I can connect you guys, I think, via email. I'll try to.
Please do. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'd note also that there's a lot of overlap between both of those and work that's happened over the years with, for example, the SSN, the Semantic Sensor Network work that has tried to do things. The GeoLink project developed ontologies for a lot of these same things, observing platforms, deployments, vessels, stuff like that. So there is existing work in the ontology world on vocabularies for some of these things. And the question is, can we get a degree of, that's exactly what SOSO is focused on, is can we get some degree of lightweight compatibility that allows us to move forward without necessarily nailing down every little detail that an ontologist might care about, which is not the same as what we are trying to do in the schema.org world, right? So
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That breaks my heart, Matt, because, I'm an ontologist by training, and I always want to get really precise. But, when we're implementing in these regions, you see it's not going to happen. So you have to allow like a graded way of doing that. So if people just want to dump text, at least the key value thing is semantically roughly controlled by schema.org.
Yeah.
But then we also provide guidance on how to deepen that. If you can be more precise semantically, then you can do it. Schema.org allows you to do that property value thing and link off to that. Just getting people used to that, I think, is a great stepping stone, because then you can connect this very generic graph to more, let's say, tuned graphs that are more, localized in that way.
Yeah, great. So Karen, did you have a question as well, or do you want to?
Sure, yeah. I'm a newbie, so this is a very entry-level question, but I was struck on Bill's bubble graph of the assets that I saw the observing platforms, but I didn't see actual sensors, the sort of physical instruments that are taking the measurements. Does that fit into this world somewhere?
Yeah, so I think there are different ways of looking at these things, and some more highly structured approaches would be platform, instrument, sensor hierarchically. A lot of what we're doing is trying to make things easier for adoption by observing networks, and they're all not all of them are necessarily tied into the latest in data science and fairness, if you follow me. So there's kind of a divide there that we have to bridge, and how we do so, I think, is a good question.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions for our three speakers before we sort of move into the structured discussion? Okay, well, the discussion that we're planning to have here is basically trying to identify what areas there are for shared interest in extensions to the SOSO guidelines. Three primary goals. One is to sort of generate an annotated list of candidate areas that we might make extensions to SOSO for. A second is to assess shared needs for those extension areas, like how many groups really would utilize those. And then third is to try to get an understanding of who'd be willing to contribute to that work. SOSO has operated exclusively on the generosity of folks like Adam, who just invested an incredible amount of time and energy in helping to clarify the terminology and build out the patterns that have been, articulated in the standard. And so it really is, everything that SOSO has done in the CSIP cluster is very much dependent on volunteer labor, and we need to figure out who's willing to participate in that. As both Bill and Pierre were talking, one of the other things that occurred to me is that we may also be able to simply adopt and or adapt the patterns that other groups might have already spent a lot of time in their smaller projects focusing on. So if you're in oceanography, you might have, participated in the Ocean Info Hub work, developed a pattern, and that might be able to be generalized for use in terrestrial systems, say, as well. So it would be interesting to see if some of this stuff could be more wholesale adopted into SOSO guidelines and conventions, or whether we need to do a separate discussion about their appropriateness across the sort of ESIP scope. Yeah, so I think this is a fairly free-form discussion, but we've got quite a few people online, so let's plan to try to have folks raise their hands and bring things up. But I have in the notes, we're going to take notes in the Google Doc, and so I please encourage people to please contribute to them. I've started a little bit of a list here. I have a few of the things that I think Bill brought up as areas: project sites, mobile platforms, campaigns, and initiatives. Karen added sensors. Pierre, maybe you could kick off with saying, if you could identify I know you had a list as well and I didn't capture it. If you could articulate that list, we can get things started and see where the discussion goes.
Yeah, sure. I could. The list is linked up in our documentation in our book. We call this like our thematics, thematic patterns. So we just call them patterns. I don't know where that started, but I'll put a link in the chat. So, that's also from the IODE and the IOC. They said, hey, look, we're particularly interested in these things to start off with experts and institutions. So we need institutes in the graph. We need documents for all of their UN document stores, spatial data, project metadata, training opportunities, and vessels. So that's where we started, but we have much more now in our GitHub repo where people are asking for things like sensors and platforms, and we can try to generalize things like schema instrument, to get to those sensors and platforms. So that's the places we go. And along the way, we came up with these, we spotted that we need to actually define supporting profiles, like things like how to handle term lists, how to handle different languages, how to deal with identifiers, also provenance. Provenance was another key thing. How do you actually capture a reasonable provenance trace when you're exchanging these snippets of metadata? So we thought about those things on the way, and we're trying to get as much of that documented in the book as possible. And I think it can be generalized. We just happen to have oceanography examples and use cases, but most of this stuff is pretty generic at the end of the day, with a few exceptions, yeah, we have a bunch. You can just check out our issue tracker. I'll filter it for these pattern requests, and that's a way to keep an eye on what's coming in. I'll drop a link in the chat.
Thanks. Maybe you could put a link in the notes to the issue tracker.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So Bill, did I capture your list right? Your 5 areas?
Yeah, I'm adding a little bit to it, but yeah.
Okay, great. So I guess I'll open the floor. Does anybody have additional sort of large scale areas, or like, as Pierre called them, thematic patterns, or different classes of stuff beyond data system repositories I think we should focus on?
Hi, this is Steve Richard. Hey, I threw in material samples in there
Right.
and measurement methods. There's work going on there's an iSamples project that's trying to develop a more cross-domain way of describing samples. And I think we could bring some of the work we've been doing there into hopefully get adopted as SOSO recommendations for sample descriptions that could serve to link data sets and publications with samples.
Cool, that's great. Any others?
Bill had research sites in his word bubble graph there. I think I've seen that come up on other projects. Is that represent on the list here?
I think research and monitoring sites is in the list.
Oh, yep, got it. Great.
There that I highlighted. Yep. That was a very general list. I thought it was interesting, Bill, how you clustered a bunch of terms the different networks were using, and that things like sites and stations were sort of semi-synonymous. And it is one of these things, like, how do you generalize across what people are doing, but also keep a fair level of of understandability of the terms when, say, it's something, a concept like a station might have different meaning in oceanography and hydrology or some other field, right? So
Or meteorology,
or
or
meteorology. Yeah.
yeah, logistical, infrastructure for multi-network observing. It's very unlike for data set or data repository or even projects that there is a lack of conformity or uniqueness. I don't know, convergence. And so there is going to be something of an apples and oranges issue with some of these things, but actually schema is really good at simplifying for utility, right? So yeah.
So I'll throw one area out that I think is also of interest to me. It's not really a new area as much as sort of an improved alignment with DCAT. I noticed that, so we have, I think, traditionally focused on the schema.org data set class and its definition. DCAT has been working on a parallel and very closely related set of terminology that in many ways is better matches the scientific community's view of a data set. It has some more expressive properties. So I think it would be really interesting for us to have the SOSO guidelines have a more specific set of recommendations around how to align between schema.org and DCAT and whether people can use properties from DCAT. Now that Google is supporting DCAT as one of its accepted vocabulary types, that makes it a lot easier for us to let people be, mix and match between those vocabularies and use the parts that they need. Steve, you have a comment on that?
Just a question. I wonder if has anybody actually tested whether the Google dataset search is harvesting the DCAT elements?
I haven't tested it. I just am basing that on the announcement they made 2 days ago to their announcements mailing list. So I have not tested it.
That would be great. I mean, I agree. I think DCAT does have some plus and some advantages for science data because it's really more oriented towards that.
Yep. Yeah, there are some awkward fits with schema.org in some ways. So, yeah. All right. Well, we have a lot of different things here. Do we have others that people might have an interest in? I haven't heard anybody say anything about software. We did try to get the code meta group that's working on a schema.org representation of scientific software into schema.org. That group's been around for several years and has a pretty mature schema and a crosswalk too. There's probably 24 different software metadata standards that are out there, and they've done a crosswalk. I was sort of part of that effort a few years ago, and there's now a new project management committee for that project, and they're really looking at aligning with the schema.org, but they're real focused on reproducible research and how to have the software side of the provenance chain be represented consistently in these schema.org records. So there's been uptake, and there's code meta records that are being added to software repositories around the world as we speak. So no one from that group could really, I guess, make it to this chat, but I think that is a parallel effort we should be paying attention to. Pierre, you have something?
Oh yeah, so actually we had a meeting today with one of our stakeholders. They work in Africa to map. They have a tool that does map layers, and so they're actually helping us lead a definition of software application. We're using that type in schema.org, which we could also extend to web application for the portals that are online. We have a branch in Otis that's just drafting it out, and they're going to try to populate it with some of their fields and see if it works for them. And they have a big metadata catalog of the sort of supporting data that goes into that software. And they want to try to generate that on the fly so that we harvest their latest version. I'll drop that in the chat, or in the document rather.
That'd be great.
Up to there, yeah.
And has that group looked at code meta, which has several years of sort of community agreement on software in schema.org?
I'm not sure. I doubt it really, because I doubt it, but we can see.
Yeah,
we can ask them, but
cool.
I don't think so.
We did quite a bit of work on that in the EarthCube geocodes activity, trying to link, data set discovery with software that would work with the data set, and trying to make the connection of getting the data to the software more seamless, which sounds similar to what you're group is looking at. And the big gap there was basically, in code meta, at least when we looked at it before, that there's no way to say this software needs this particular kind of data format as input. And how do you get a distribution of that data in the correct input that will work with the software? And so we did, some work. I think, Matt, you've seen it basically on a registry of more specific file formats that were oriented towards thinking about what exact kind of format, what does a software application need in order to operate? For instance, if you're looking at a map layer, what kind of, it'll take shape files or something. I mean, there's getting those kind of details into the metadata is tricky.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what we saw in our schema.org thing is, they have this sort of, you can reference the supporting data sets, which can be a data feed, a data set, or a data catalog, right? So it does give people options, particularly if they're the publisher of the software. And then we'll see if people are releasing independent typed patterns on data feeds, data sets, etc. If they can say it's compatible somehow with a certain software, that would help. But yeah, distributions and stuff is always a different issue. But we have to start somewhere, right?
Yep. All right, so we have a fairly long list here, and I'm curious, we're there's a pretty diverse set of things that we could focus on as part of the cluster. If people have other things, please feel free to continue to raise them. But I'm curious, like if the cluster were to focus on a few of these, which of these would be useful? Like if you're running a repository or you have a research program that's going to produce schema.org, or you're a harvester that's trying to harvest schema.org, which of these would be on the top of your priority list in terms of which to get sort of conventions and agreements on first?
I know that the Polar community has been interested in observing assets. Obviously, like Bill came from the Polar community and gave a talk there, but I think I would put in another vote for that one based on what the Polar advisory group has to say.
Yeah, and those observing assets, there's a bunch of them. Are any of those 5 that Bill listed, or are the other ones that are related, like vessels, of higher priority to the Polar community than others?
I'd say research and monitoring sites. Not only is there a lot of interest there, but there's a need for some guidance for a simplified profile.
Okay. Any others? There's a lot of folks on the call that we haven't heard from, so I don't know what communities everybody represents, but there are folks from terrestrial community. We've heard a bit from polar and oceans. Anybody from atmosphere, terrestrial studies, biological networks?
Yeah, this is Nick. The sample description stuff would be very helpful for us.
Material samples.
Yeah, material samples.
How much do you think that is something that SOSO as a cluster should tackle versus really trying to, like, how much is iSamples and that kind of a funded project already heading down that path? Is that something we can adopt from that's coming out of those groups? Or Dave, you've been heavily involved in that, right? So do you have a sense of whether there's a role for SOSO in this space?
Yeah, there is. I'm not sure where to go with it. So the main issue, though, that I see is we're dealing at a very, very fine-grained sort of mode of operation where we're looking at individual samples and describing those. I think SOSO really comes in at the sort of the higher level descriptions, just purely for efficiency reasons and scalability issues. If you're talking millions and millions of little samples, describing those, it's certainly useful to do through schema.org. I'd be very, yeah, there's definitely overlap. So, gosh, I mean, all the different controlled vocabularies, for example, I think they would fit nicely into some of the so-so mechanics. Yeah, it'd be interested to see where conversation would go on this.
I think that the question would be what kind of use case are we imagining? And I think you're right. We probably don't want to see people putting a bunch of schema.org metadata in landing pages for millions of samples. I'm not sure that would be useful, but the use case for having a clear way to link between, let's say, a data set and the samples that were used in that data set. Just having a pattern for that, and we can use the existing sample identifiers for that link. I think it'd be pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's a good point. So kind of aligned with the reliquary concept.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on the other hand, so Dave, you were in Maria, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So when we were in that meeting in Maria, we talked about like when you kidnapped me into the iSamples meeting. I'll never forget that. So that was interesting because we saw that it is compatible. Like your iSamples infrastructure could, in theory, generate, if you have a schema, it could generate the JSON LD, maybe not embedded in pages, but even in a sort of document store of JSON LD documents. And in the oceanography world, we do have people who are asking for those millions of samples. They want to search across the whole index, right? Making that performant is another question, but at least having access to that, I don't think it's infeasible, certainly. And I think it would be quite welcome because through iSamples and through the RCN that you have, what is sampling nature RCN, you're doing the same thing that PID inst is doing for sensors, right? Kind of agreeing with an international community on some sort of kernel metadata. And that's the stuff we can try to serialize in a so-so pattern. And people can then release it in any resolution that they want to, maybe all of their samples, or just maybe a sample catalog. I don't know if we can do that, if there's a type for that, but I think it would be useful to even just have the scheme for that.
Okay, sure. I'm a little bit unclear where it fits into the so-so, the schema.org model though. There's a physical sample. I don't recall, is there a place for like a sample or a specimen?
Not really.
Not really, yeah. So it'd be an extension of some sort, but yeah, sure. I mean, the goal is for interoperability here, so.
Yeah, I mean, we could, at the worst case scenario, if schema.org doesn't have it, we can just say it's a thing, right? And then use some additional typing inside it.
Yeah, exactly.
Link off to things like the the biocollections ontology or something like that describes what a sample is to like a reasoner or like a semantic agent. So we could do it, and then we can put an issue on the schema.org tracker saying, hey, look, we've basically done it for you. At your leisure, please add a sample type or something.
Yeah, we can totally do that.
So like the way that we start a notice is just saying, hey, if you're the expert on the metadata that's like the essential metadata for a sample, let us know what that is, and then we start to massage it into a JSON LD schema.org compliant chunk. I don't know, Matt, would that work?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there's different ways of viewing schema.org its role in the world. I think one of them is, I think we talked about it the other day in the semantics cluster, is kind of like a gateway into more formal semantics. Like it's a lightweight way to have mixed vocabularies and embedded into a single record that you can then start pulling in and basically linking into formal vocabularies. The other way is to look at it as a very lightweight record that's just meant for high-level data discovery and resource discovery, and it's not meant to replace in any way the disciplinary metadata standards that go into these much more detailed representations, like iSamples does for samples, or that like ISO or other standards do for geospatial data. So I think that there is a little bit of a challenge. Like we try to keep it lightweight, and we've always sold it on its lightweight nature. And the more we go down these deep semantic linkage pathways, I think the harder it gets for people to adopt. So I'm not sure where we want to fall on that trade-off, but yeah.
I have a response to that, but I see Ruth's hand up, so.
Yeah.
Well, if you're if your response to that is on topic, go ahead, because I kind of want to change the topic just a little bit.
I'll keep it really brief. I think, we should always have that lightweight discovery philosophy with the schema.org thing. But then if you have an implementation partner like iSamples who do it well, you should kind of like give another example just with that. You don't have to commit to any kind of semantic framework. Just say, working with them, this is how you can go deep, right? So you have like a 2-gear system there. And I think that could be a really nice and instructive way to show it. Here's the generic option, and here's a partner that goes deeper, and here's how you can do that, either in their way or similar to it. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. So Ruth, go ahead. And after Ruth, I'd like to, I haven't been able to keep up with the chat, so I'd like to see if there's things we should highlight from that are going on in this extensive chat discussion as well. But Ruth.
Yeah, so actually, I'm bringing this up because it was asked in my session yesterday, and I promised Dan Barrios that I would bring it up here, so I'm going to. And that is that there is the bioschemas group, and Dan's trying to figure out how SOSO and the bioschemas group, etc. Basically can come together better. So he was thinking, should there be something here in ESIP or in RDA? And the issue is that we actually do have projects that actually cross the genomic earth science boundary. And and so the question is what do they do if they're trying to represent work that does that sort of crossing of what used to be very stovepipe disciplinary boundaries, and how do we get all these things to play nicely together? And so that's my question.
It's a great question. And I think that there's, one of the nice things about the life sciences stuff is that they have invested deeply in ontology and vocabulary development, and there is a lot of rich stuff there already. So it strikes me that adoption is very much a possibility in a lot of that space. That said, it is a big, complicated space, and so there is a role for that. Adam, when we started off, you I think started talking about the science on schema.org. We talked about calling it geoschemas.org to be a geo partner to the bioschemas thing, right? Do you want to comment on like what's the relationship between those two and the RDA efforts and others, and what role the ESIP cluster could or should have?
Sure. Yeah. From what I can remember, so we did set up this geoschemas effort, but that was really just a way for us to publish out like geoscience specific extensions. And we tried to, we mulled over like, oh, should we call this like geosciences schema.org? And if I remember correctly, I think someone encouraged us to go bold and just go all of sciences and just plant the flag.
That might have been me.
I didn't want to call anybody out, Matt, but I appreciate you. And I think it was a good choice, and in talking with the bioschemas folks, they don't seem offended by it at all. If they are, then they haven't, out and out said it. But I think we have a good relationship with them, especially through the RDA group on research metadata schemas. And I think a lot of the stuff is very complementary. And, we've adopted a lot of the styling or the ways that they communicate their profiles. So, I think it's very complementary. But anyway, that's all I can remember, Matt. If you remember other details, please correct me.
I don't, although I think we did say explicitly that it seemed that bioschemas is a very healthy, active community that continues to both adopt and extend schema.org in really good ways for the life sciences. And it feels like they have a good handle on that, and that we should contribute to and participate in that rather than trying to change the focal emphasis. Like we can join their community rather than creating a new one, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the answers to Dan, Ruth, I think should be we should engage in bioschemas.org. They are very well established. I think the challenge there is that they're very focused on biomedical, and it's a sort of like the more environmental biology applications that you talked about are where we intersect, and maybe that hasn't been as much of an emphasis there. although probably increasingly so as like environmental genomics and stuff becomes really a prevalent sensing technique. So I identified, we're at about half past here. I identified from this discussion so far, I think at the bottom of the where we're taking notes, I identified high priority areas that have been, there's more listed, but the ones that were sort of seconded for focus are sites, projects, sensors, samples, and DCAT alignment. Are there any others? Is that a list of things that people would be interested in contributing to? Are there any other areas that I didn't catch from the discussion? In particular, the stuff that's going on in the chat. Like I said, I haven't really been able to catch up with that. I noticed there's a lot that Karen and Pierre and Joan and others are saying in there. So sensors.
There was a chat about use in citations.
So like, sorry, use of what in citations?
Sorry, apologies if this is a basic question, but can SOSO be used for tracking use in citations, or is it already used for this?
I see. We don't have it. I mean, a SOSO record basically exposes the structured metadata about, for example, a data set, which allows for people to cite those data using the identifier that is there. And we've talked about citation metadata. What we don't have in SOSO is any representation of usage or citation levels. We talked about that. We have a ticket on that. And we have not yet incorporated that because there are other groups focused on that. So the Make Data Count project and Data Site have basically been working on building services for aggregating usage and citation data, and they've come up with standardized formats for reporting that for data sets. So it's struck us, I think, when we had the conversation earlier that we should be follow along with that. There's the counter code of practice for research data that governs how people should report data usage in a way that's consistent across repositories and whatnot. I don't know if there's a role for SOSO in here for exposing some of that. It's something that changes pretty rapidly, like possibly daily. And so maybe I think there was a bit of a feeling that SOSO record is meant to be more of the long-term characteristics of a data set and not necessarily the stuff that's changing minute by minute or hour by hour, but open to thoughts on whether we should jump in there or not. Who brought that up? Phil? Didn't catch that. I still haven't found it in the chat.
Just reading this from the chat, it was put in by Joan.
Okay. Oh, Joan there. Thoughts, Joan, on those issues of like the counter practice and what it's in the sort of rapidity of the changes here?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I was just curious if we are like working towards that, like as a data repository, like we should kind of focus on the recommendations from DataCite, like using related identifiers, for example.
Yep. And related identifiers are in SOSO in the sense that we have this list of identifiers that are associated with a data set. We don't have as many types as DataCite has, so that would be an interesting thing to potentially explore.
Yeah, we came across that, Doug, if you're here, like I think, we came across that also and noticed that, people are using different identifiers, and you can type the identifier too, right, as a property value, and then like link off to some description of what that identifier is. I think there's a registry of identifiers, probably it's in DataCite or something. So, you can capture it in schema.org, even if you're, you don't have to admit new properties, as long as somebody else is kind of systematic about it.
Yep. Yep. Okay, so I'm just curious if of those 6 areas, who on this call would be willing to put in some time focusing on any of those 6 areas? Don't be shy.
I could look at the samples, think about the linking to the samples. I'll talk to Pester Nick about that.
Yeah, we can talk together about that, Steve. That's great.
Yeah, and I'm already involved in the samples.
Yeah.
So I'll dive right into that too.
Yep.
Yeah.
And like pretty much all of them. Well, the sites, project sensors, and samples, they're all part of our Otis plan anyway. So I think myself and I think we can assign some time from other people on Otis to that.
Great.
Because we definitely
So
want
we're
the
kind
Otis patterns to be aligned to whatever this group does.
So Adam, we're kind of at this junction between the list and the roadmap. And I don't know if you had a thought on how you want to run the second half of this discussion.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do in the second half, at least, is sort of prioritize this list. Is there low-hanging fruit where we're really close? How's people's time and availability? What's the need? So if folks could comment on that, maybe we just run right down the list. We can start at sites and just get people's or thoughts on urgency, availability, how difficult. Yeah.
So Bill has his hand up.
So Otis has already started working on some schema profiles for patterns such as projects and vessels. And so I'm just curious about the interrelationship here. Would SOSO, for example, develop guidelines for projects that is just kind of sort of hand in hand with Otis, or how does that work?
I think that would be the ideal case. Yeah, I mean, you can take the Otis work as a starting point and then more brain power looking at that. We have slightly different, let's say, operational requirements that it has to work in our implementation regions, Africa, Latin America, Pacific. So our steering committee will check that too. But I can't imagine that we're going to get so wildly different. So as much alignment as possible between Otis and SOSO, the better. Certainly, we want this to crosswalk.
So in this case, it's not exactly like duplicated effort or inflicting efforts. It's
I would see it as like
complementary.
Yeah, complementary. Because again, if one of our main goals in Otis is to query other graphs, like the Poulter graph, like anybody else's graph, right? And SOSO as a kind of hub of normalization for that, we want to try to keep as close as possible. So I don't know how we set up our work cycle that we do like a mutual review. And then if there is a difference or an incompatibility, we should explain why. Like if there's some kind of constraint with our stakeholders that we have to do it, we should explain why so it's clearly documented, and then try as much as possible to avoid it.
So I'll speak on behalf of POWIG in that we are very interested in contributing, helping, essentially from a perspective of the polar observing community, that some of our members are, more on top of federated search and metadata standardization, but it varies. So, POWIG's very interested in sites and projects, perhaps sensors, as observing networks are currently tracking them, or how they really should be better tracking them. So it's not like we're going to get into schema profiles ourselves, but we can contribute to that effort.
But if there's like an overlapping need, like the case is here for platforms and sensors.
Most definitely. The challenge in this realm is to get those that are authoritative sources to adopt fairness.
Right. I think if they can see the added value, like if they see if other people are spinning up graphs and they want to cross query them, it can be motivating for them. And I know like Taco de Bruin is also involved in the polar communities very heavily. Yeah. He's one of the co-chairs of the IODE on the ocean side. Yeah. So we can also try to motivate it from that side too, because it's definitely a shared interest, particularly in the Arctic, which is like most of the ocean most of the year.
Yep. Yep.
Great, thank you.
All right, so I don't know, Adam, were you the one that was just adding all this structure to the high priority areas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Bill, is there like a project tied to this that has like deadlines where you'd like to see?
Well, isn't it for all these things? Wasn't it yesterday was the deadline? I'm just coming in this group. I'm happy to engage in the future. Encourage others from Pogue too. So, but I don't want to speak
Sure.
towards relative urgency.
Okay. What about the difficulty of that task? Is that
For sites?
yeah?
Say,
Could anyone comment on that?
there are numerous metadata standards that relate to this that we can so-called riff off of, as well as some publications and well-documented implementations where, for example, some common elements could be more easily identified. So I think sites is
So
easier
Bill,
in that regard than some other things maybe.
so when you say there's lots of standards, I think that's a good thing because that means that there's lots of working vocabularies to come from. In the schema.org world, we're not trying to change or even we're not a standardization effort, right? We're trying to guide people on how to use vocabularies that already exist and or link those into schema.org. Can you see a pathway where like we did with other parts of the schema.org conventions where we said, don't invent a new vocabulary, use this vocabulary, and here's how you incorporate it into a schema.org record. So is there a set of vocabularies that we could be promoting in the site space that does already uniform, sites and stations and that sort of thing that we could then be pointing at and saying, this is a good source? And I don't know, Pierre, if you've already done that on Otis or not, and have a starting point that we could be looking at.
Yeah, you might have some good input there. In general, we're looking at these authoritative sources, which are organizations that track, say, research and monitoring sites, right? And maybe I'm out in left field, but I don't think I am, that a lot of them are not adopting controlled vocabularies. So anything done could help. This does relate somewhat to within the observing community that there is a move towards things that ocean sciences have done really well with, like the GOOSE essential ocean variables, or with the global climate essential variables, and then but those things are not necessarily machine readable and interoperable, really.
Right.
So vocabularies, the difficult thing is that it's not well recognized need to adopt them. The advantage is that now is prime time to really make a substantial improvement by providing guidance and making it easier. And yeah.
So like I agree like very much with that. It's like we sometimes find specifications that are really good, but there's no dereferenceable IRI, it's not linked to data on the web sort of stuff, right? So we can't really embed it and reuse it in let's say the normal way in modern data systems. But what we can do is something like we've seen with like our protected areas group, they already have really fixed metadata fields that they know work. They know stakeholders want that. We see this with that PID inst for instruments, right? They know what their kernel metadata is. Sometimes they even offer some IRIs, but they're in systems that have just been spun up recently and we have no idea about the sustainability or longevity, right? So we're kind of loath to recommend them right away, but at least we know what the core metadata is. And there's usually a way in schema.org to sort of at least render that. And in a sense, that's a kind of call, a general call, like saying, hey, somebody please build a reliable vocabulary or ontology for these things in the future, and then we can embed it, right? But in the meantime, at least we know what those fields are. We can create a template and say, please populate this, and at least we know roughly what we're talking about. And then iteratively get deeper.
So I saw Rob Rivetta, you had your hand up, but put it back down, and you have something you want to bring up here, or?
Sure. It was more of a general input to just some points. So I'm a formal ontologist and terminologist, and when it comes to these systems, whether it be control vocabularies or ontologies or otherwise, there's aspects that you need to consider, such as is there any quantitative evidence for their utility? So this is one thing that seems to be lacking in the community at large, is actual actual evidence for the utility of one or another sort of system. And and so that's something I think that can guide the directions of what sort of systems one may want to build or use. And that is also something that's important for stakeholders or potential sources of funding, is to say, well, this is more than just a hype, this is more than just a fad or whatnot. Now, I personally am not interested in promoting a particular type of system or not, for ethical and other reasons. But if you have quantitative evidence that would show one or other sort of system brings a return on investment or is more computationally efficient than another, then that will help in various levels of project development and execution. And that's one point. The other is just a general input on the idea of reusing vocabularies. So it depends on if you're it depends on if you're talking about purely a set of words that don't have any background or more generic associations. That is, if you're just using a vocabulary that does not, let's say, assume or rely on another system, then there's less things to consider. But for more complex systems, at least things like ontologies that are developed to very high degrees of complexity, it's not simply about terms, not simply about natural language words, because often there are other imported or dependent systems, whether they be ontologies or otherwise, that the given ontology uses, and therefore there are ethical and technical reasons for not simply appealing to the cliche of reuse or don't recreate the wheel. Those are actually false arguments. They're actually invalid arguments to a large degree when it comes to the more complex systems like ontologies. So there's different aspects to consider. Over.
Okay, thanks for those comments. And I'll just say one quick thing about the system stuff is that I think the cluster and ESIP in general haven't been in the business of recommending systems or choosing systems. We really focus on trying to create guidelines around use and adoption that can be used across a variety of different systems and platforms and networks. So we haven't really been focusing so much on on a specific system, more on the conventions around metadata representation. So, okay, so Adam, how do you want to?
Yeah,
we have 10 minutes left or 11 minutes left. How do you want to try to pull this together? I think we're going to have a hard time if we try to go through each of the 6
one by one
areas.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was wondering if we could just, vote by raise of hands. We'll just call out the one area and just count up the votes, and then maybe that'll help us figure out like priority interest. What do you think?
That sounds great. Are these votes for the priority or who wants to be involved? Maybe we do it for each.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just start with the research and monitoring sites. Can we just have a call of hands for interest?
And you want people to, what do you want them to do? Just raise their hand if they have interest in this as being something that the cluster focuses on?
Yes. Yep. So right now
Okay.
there's 3. We got 3 votes for sites.
I think you can, if you don't know where your raise your hand function, it should be in the reactions
There it is.
panel.
Yep. So we got 8 total. All right. And then for folks that might be interested in working on that, feel free to raise your hand. If we see more than 8, then we know something's suspect. All right, 3, that's good.
3 there.
Thanks. Okay, on the projects, folks that think describing research projects would be of use for SOSA to tackle. So interest in projects, raise your hands. All right. And then folks that would be interested in helping us define what research projects are. Is it really 4? Okay. Okay, cool. Great. All right, let's move on to sensors. So sensors, instrumentation, folks that really think or would find value in SOSA tackling description of sensors. Okay. We've got 6. All right. And how many folks would like to work on helping us come up with that? Okay. I see 4 so far. Good, good. All right. The last one here, people. Okay. So samples. Who would like to see SOSO come up with some guidelines on how to describe samples, material samples? All right, so pretty even distribution. Okay, so 5. And to help us define what that sample description might be, who would be interested in helping? All right, looks like 4 there. Okay. All right, awesome. Well, I don't know how we want to weight this. Do folks have thoughts or ideas on how to weight? Oh, I guess we got a couple more. Sorry. So DCAT alignment. Folks want to vote on SOSA putting together an alignment to DCAT.
Yeah, I'd do that one too, Adam. I can't seem to find my raise hand button for some reason, but
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll call that 4. And then how many folks would want to work on that? Oh, I see 5. Okay. Geez, we've got good distribution across these topics. All right. And folks that want to work on that, is that Steve and I assume you, Matt?
Yep.
Okay. And then this last one, related identifiers for linking to sources. I mean, we kind of do have related identifiers in there, but maybe there's some more work that needs to be done there. Is that the idea?
Yeah, and I think it's clarifying some of the guidance around how that's used for linking to citations and usage statistics and stuff like that through DataCite and other programs that are focused on that. So
yeah. Yes, okay. All right. So yeah, folks that think we should clarify that, how many vote for related identifiers? Zero. Okay. All right. Well, maybe we can
I think, you know, like I don't fully appreciate like what the issue is there, I think. So that's primarily why I'm not raising my hand here.
yeah, I think it is a little bit of a different thing. We're not so much, yeah, it's more about linkages between systems and whether we can represent some of that in schema.org. So can we, for example, get linkages to related identifiers from, say, papers that cite a data set and therefore use that as a way to help feed citation accounting services and that are trying to accumulate that stuff. Right now, most of that's based on reporting, not on, say, individual data sets sort of identifying, say, like lists of papers that cite it or publishers.
Okay.
A lot of it's driven from the publisher side. So
I think that could be really important quite soon because, you know, there's this whole thing about like a digital impact factor, like a data set impact factor, as opposed to just papers, right? So a bunch of scholarly publishing things are working on that to figure out how to do it. And so I guess it will become important, but I think the problem definition, we need some work on that just to think about it.
Yeah. And like I said, I really recommend that people that are interested in this get involved with the Make Data Count project, which is now I think they're in the 6th or 7th year of working on this kind of issue, and really have a pretty solid collaborative group doing this. Mostly there's an RDA working group on it. Yeah.
Great. All right. It looks like for some of these topics, we've got some sources listed, places where we can draw inspiration or alignment to. Some of them are missing, and some of these ones that were voted on fairly highly. So for example, the research projects. Does anyone have any ideas of sources that we might look to? Pierre, did you had a, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we have a project. We actually, it's running. It's where we're exchanging project data with a number of repositories in Otis and OIH right now. So maybe that can be the starting point, and then we can see if we can extend it, modify it, etc.
Okay, great.
And is there a relationship between the project stuff and organizational or institutional identifiers like ROAR identifiers?
They can do it. So again, we don't tell our stakeholders what they have to put into the profiles, but yeah, indeed, you can have a snippet for the institution or the main contributing partner, which can be a person or type institution organization, right? So yeah, you can add that if the partners can add that if they want to. I don't think I can't share my screen, but no, I think we have some stuff flowing in the system right now.
Okay. Well, so Adam, do you want to, I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion of the cluster. Adam, do you want to sort of talk about cluster meetings and like how we might move this forward?
Sure. Yeah, right. So we've got a couple minutes left. As I was mentioning earlier, the cluster meets on Thursdays. It's actually the fourth Thursday of every month. And so today would have been the day, literally like at 2:30, so 27 minutes ago. And so a month from now, which I believe is, I don't have the exact date here, but yeah, fourth Thursday in February would be our next meeting. So we encourage you to attend. I'll throw the link into the, or do we already have the connection details? It's right here on Zoom through ESIP. I'll make sure that those connection details are in the Google Doc. We've got a mailing list. We've got a Slack channel, sci-schema.org on the ESIP Slack, and it's fairly active. So feel free to jump in there. We've got a living agenda doc that has notes from all of our past discussions. And we love having visitors come in, and we hope those visitors come back. And so if any of these topics were interesting to you, we hope to see you in February as we start to plan this stuff out, and we really appreciate the ideas on what to work on next. This is really exciting for us to jump back into the fray. So yeah, any closing thoughts, Matt, or anyone else?
No, thanks, Adam. I appreciate that. So we need to capture 3 takeaways. And I think that, you know, if I were to summarize right now, I think it seems clear that we do have interest in furthering the extensions and scope of the SOSO guidelines so that people can interoperate. And it seems like there's a group of people that are interested in helping to participate in various parts of that. So I think our takeaways are that the cluster will try to continue and develop out a more detailed plan. And we really encourage everybody to help join in and do that. It's been a really fun collaborative group over the last couple of years. So I hope folks join us on our Thursday calls. So with that, I think we can.
Matt and could you? It's in the ESIP calendar, right? But I don't think everybody knows how to get there. I think so. Like I mean,
Yes.
I don't know. I can't remember where I got the ESIP calendar link.
Or right at the science, if you go to scienceonschema.org, put that in your browser, you'll hit our GitHub page, and the connection details are there as well. I know the ESIP calendar, I always struggle to find where that is. But our next meeting is February 23rd, 2:30 Eastern time. So we hope to see y'all there.
Yep, looking forward to it.
Cool. Thanks for the session, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah,
everyone.
thank you. It's great fun.
Ciao.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
So long.